Welcome to the Femsplainers. I'm Danielle Crittenden, and I'm joined in the studio today not with Christina, who is away, but with Mona Charen, good friend of the podcast, has been a guest before, author of Sex Matters, How Modern Feminism Lost Touch with Science, Love, and Common Sense. A senior fellow. Can we say fellow for you, Mona? It's kind of male.
Just for now.
Okay. Senior
Soon it's
person.
going to be non-binary.
Senior non-binary at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and host of the Beg to Differ podcast, which is, how would you describe it? It's certainly more political than our podcast.
Yes. It's based out of the Bulwark, which is a fantastic startup online that features great commentary that's conservative but non-Trumpy. And the podcast is a roundtable discussion. There's a sort of flagship podcast that Charlie Sykes does every day, Monday through Friday. And then we do a once-a-week podcast with a roundtable. So it's Bill Galston of Brookings and the Wall Street Journal, Linda Chavez of the Niskanen Center, Damon Linker of The Week, and me. And then usually we have a guest. We had David Frum recently, who was brilliant.
I'm really not a big fan of David Frum.
Well, this time he was good. I urge you to give him another chance.
I have to listen to him all the time.
So mostly we have a guest, and we discuss the news of the week, and we're hoping to model polite, civil disagreement where we have disagreement. A lot of the time we do agree, because we're center left and center right. Yeah. So when it comes to things about the impeachment, we tend to agree. But when we talk about the Obama administration, that's where the disagreement tends to come out.
Do you have booze on your podcast?
Both center right and center left?
No, booze.
Oh, booze.
Not booze. Not B-O-O-S. Which you wouldn't hear if you did.
So, right. Yeah, we don't, but we're aspiring to that.
Let's see. I've already poured
at 2:00. So
what kind of excuse is that? Oh, it's sun's over the yardarm somewhere. Well, I've poured Mona a glass of red wine. Christina, by the way, those of you who listened to last week's podcast, learned that her great friend Roger Scruton had died, Sir Roger Scruton, and so she decided to hop on a plane and go to London to be at the funeral. So leaving me stranded.
Former colleague, actually, at EPPC. He was.
Oh, he was at AP. Mm-hmm. He wasn't at. I think he was at AEI at some point too.
He might have been.
He was kind of promiscuous with his think tank associations.
He will be missed.
Did you know him at all?
Yeah, I did. He was brilliant and fun and played a great piano.
Yes, I think I was there once at Christina's house when he played a sing-along.
Yeah. So, but for anyone, I mentioned this on our own podcast, I'll mention it here too, for anyone who wants to get to a sense of his contribution, I highly recommend a video that he made many years ago that was on the BBC. You can find it on YouTube. It's called Why Beauty Matters.
Yes.
It's so fabulous.
Yes.
Yeah.
He wrote, we talked about his appreciation of beauty, and but we didn't mention that YouTube video.
So it's available, so I recommend it.
All right. Well, we're going to go into some of the topics of the week. And Mona, since you're a much more serious person than Christina and I usually are, I thought, this is quite a serious story on sex, and it goes to your theme on Sex Matters. Recently, Governor Cuomo has announced sweeping changes to the criminal laws governing intoxicated sex. He characterized these reforms as merely, quote unquote, closing a loophole in the rape laws to make it so that not only involuntarily but voluntarily intoxicated people are unable to consent to sexual activity. So basically, anyone who is a little drunk cannot say yes, which I think rules out certainly a lot of married sex.
It sure does. I mean,
a lot of sex in general.
It's, yeah. And so, look, living in the real world, what it means is that, because everybody agrees that if if someone gets somebody else drunk or, God forbid, puts a date rape, drug in their drink, that's obviously assault and it's horrible. And but what this broadens it out to is somebody voluntarily gets drunk. And let's face it, a lot of women get drunk exactly because it has a disinhibiting effect and they may want that. That if they then later, if they have sex under those conditions, they can then later say that they were raped, because even if they got drunk voluntarily, it's automatically rape under this law. That's kind of worrisome. Well,
and it makes no allowance for the assumption behind this law. And whenever you put things into law that legislate how people behave with each other in a bedroom, gets very, very worrisome.
Yeah, exactly.
The assumption is that a man, even if intoxicated, if he has sex, he is still to blame.
Correct.
So it is only the person, only really the woman. I don't know how this is going to work in gay relationships, but I think the premise is that any woman who is drunk cannot say yes. And this came about in California in 2016 after, if you remember, famously the Stanford swimmer Brock Turner, he didn't have sex with Chanel, the later revealed, she written a book about the experience, Chanel Miller. She was known as Emily Doe at the time. She had passed out.
Right.
And he was found on top of her. And he was convicted of assault, not rape. But then Governor Jerry Brown put this into law that any intoxicated person cannot give consent. So this is now broadening this to New York State. And I think, as Christina has said in the past on this program, if two people are intoxicated, or maybe two women having, does that mean they rape each other?
But under the law, it clearly does. And by the way, when you talk to campus administrators and you talk to students, they will deny that women are always the ones being raped. They'll say that a drunk woman can rape a man. So
yeah, I've always wondered how that works.
I wonder how that works, just, the physics of it myself. But, they say this, right? So,
well, I guess if you broaden rape to not just be the sexual act as we think of it, but really any kind of forcible, unconsented to sexual.
I guess so. Now,
this is what's going to happen in our courtrooms. We're going to start parsing.
I know.
Well, how did, so did you have an orgasm?
Right. Or did, so
does that matter?
Like about 25 years ago, there was a college called Antioch that passed these rules about how you had to have sex. And they said you have to ask permission for each stage. So if you want to kiss a woman, you have to say, may I kiss you? And if you want to unbutton your blouse, may I unbutton your blouse, and so on. And it was ridiculed everywhere, including on Saturday Night Live.
Right.
Okay. So that was then. But now these things are being legislated in a number of different states where it has to be affirmative consent, which is basically the same
But now
thing.
They're eliminating this now.
Well,
because if you
in
affirmative
this case,
consent,
yes, it wouldn't apply.
Drunk,
yeah,
it would not apply.
You cannot. So as you said, you made the right point. So a woman, it will be deemed, or the person who is raped will be deemed not to be able to give consent because she's drunk, but the guy who is also drunk will not be seen as a mitigating factor. The fact that he was drunk cannot be entered into evidence to say that he couldn't form the intent to commit the crime because he was drunk.
Right. And it's also always, I think the other objections we've expressed before is this infantilization of women, that somehow a man who is drunk is still regarded under this type of law as having enough wits to be charged with knowingly raping someone,
right,
versus a woman who, no matter what she says and no matter what her state of intoxication, is always going to be the victim.
So in my book, I parted company from some of the people on the right, who are, kind of like with a wink and a nod saying, come on, girls, stop being sissies and just enjoy yourselves.
Those people, I don't think I've ever met those people.
I have.
Where have you been hanging out?
Yeah, you hear this on the right. But
God.
So I believes strongly that men should be gentlemen and should always respect women and should always be careful to make sure they have the woman's enthusiastic consent. At the same time, I really rebel against the feminist line, which is, somebody developed a nail polish that would change color if a woman had ingested a date rape drug. Right. And a bunch of feminists objected to this. And why could they possibly? How could you object to that? Well, they said,
I don't want like the color it was.
Yeah, that's exactly. It was the color. I don't want to live in a world where I have to watch what I drink or what I wear or how much I drink. Men should just be told not to rape, period. And that is just...
I think also, by the way, men are told not to rape, period.
Well,
I don't think there's anyone walking around.
I know.
Please rape women.
I know. Well, although in fairness,
incel community.
No, in fairness, some men do. There is a little bit of a the old boy culture that says the more notches on your belt that you get, the better. There's a lot of that.
Yeah, of course.
But the idea that women should not have to take any responsibility for guarding what they do, how much they drink, where they put themselves, whether they're putting themselves at risk is crazy. It's just not the world we live in. And it never will be the world that exists.
Well, one of the problems with using the law as this blunt instrument to govern intimate relations is I think we've lost these codes, these social codes between men and women. So when you say, I expect men to be a gentleman, we don't know what a gentleman is anymore.
That's true.
That sounds sort of archaic. And what does that mean? And who teaches you to be a gentleman? Usually it comes through the father or with, the mother correcting. One of the things I've learned, and I have sympathy for this other side, not in the way that it infantilizes women or makes them always victims, but I've got daughters in the school, young world culture. Ella, you can back me up on this or not, but they're at schools and colleges. There are very pushy men who are nice boys, what we would call nice boys, and I never believed this could go on, but it does. That at parties, in situations, the girl can be drunk or sober, but they really will push. And to the degree that you could classify it as at least attempted sexual assault. So so I can see why women are angry and young women are angry because they're almost powerless to describe why this is wrong if you're saying, don't be prudish. I mean, everything that they say is going on in ways that it just didn't happen. I mean, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. It's not like that was the time of Cary Grant.
Nope.
But it just didn't. I think there was still the remnants of codes.
There were. And
the idea that a guy would push himself on you, a friend, somebody you thought you knew, and even with you saying no, it was just unheard of.
Right. And that's exactly right. And I heard this again and again in the interviews that I did for my book.
Talked to tons of young women, right?
I talked to tons of young women, and they are a lot of them feel under siege. You know, that it is just, there are no codes. Men don't know how to behave. They don't know that they're being offensive to young women. There's a terrible disconnect. Right. They do feel entitled, and some of them will even admit it. A lot of the guys that I spoke to on college campuses, for example, would say, well, yeah, I mean, social life is a lot better for guys than for women. They'll admit that. And so when we threw out, obviously we can't return to the standards of the 1950s or even the 1960s or 70s, but we can reestablish certain standards about how you treat other people, and that sex is something that is intimate, and that women are more vulnerable than men when it comes to sex, and that they deserve special consideration and politeness and honor. Those are all things that would go a long way. And unfortunately, we're not doing that. What we're doing is we're passing laws like Cuomo, saying, well, okay, so if you're drunk, you can't consent, and, or affirmative consent laws, And it's very clumsy, and it's not going to work because these things have to be very, very subtle and conveyed, as you say, by parents, by the entire culture. I think I might have mentioned in my book, if I didn't, I should have, the movie, The Philadelphia Story, where
the old one, not the
old one. The old one. The old one. Where this is the 1930s, but like attraction between men and women is eternal, hasn't changed. Codes have changed, but there's a scene where Katharine Hepburn character gets very drunk with the Jimmy Stewart character, and she gets so drunk that the next morning she doesn't remember what happened. And there's a really funny scene where, she sort of thinks they must have slept together, and he has to tell her that no, he put her in bed, and she's engaged to somebody else, by the way, that he put her in bed and left. And so there's, this kind of a funny scene where she says, well, was I unattractive? I mean, was there something wrong with me? And and he said, well, no, on the contrary, he says, but there are rules about that sort of thing.
Right.
And I love that scene, and I think they're, that kind of subtle social thing is the way to go.
It's like the lost language of sexual intimacy, and it's now the way that the younger sexes speak to each other is all in terms of politics, power.
Yeah, power, I know.
Power, and in power, men are going to win.
Yeah.
But
and besides which, if our most intimate relations are based on power, it's not a very loving kind of way to live, is it? I mean, no. So
no. Anyway, well, that's coming to New York. But Mona, I really have a much more serious story for you. And this is, let me just preface this by saying this is about real discrimination. I think it's a discrimination you don't hear a lot about. You could almost call it a hidden discrimination. And this is the pocket issue with girls.
Oh.
Girls and pockets. That apparently girls' clothes that don't contain pockets are oppressive.
Right.
And discriminatory.
I knew there was something.
Yes, right? Okay,
yeah.
This is true. And I'm reading from the Washington Post. The headline is, Why Girls Need Pockets. Sexism has shaped kids' clothes, and it has a real impact. And then it goes on to say, pockets, like most apparel, have a gendered history. It's only recently trickled down to children's clothing, and there are now hashtags, Twitter hashtags, hashtag pocket for girls and hashtag girls deserve pockets. And the reason is that women's apparel, Ella, you looked up the history of why this has become this fraught issue, that the loss of pockets for women, which was sort of seen as a sign of progress because you don't need pockets if you're, got a purse, it's now a problem. Why is it so problematic?
Well, it has had a storied history throughout the ages. So pockets it means little bags in French.
Poche.
Yes, and throughout much of the 18th century, women's pockets were like a money belt, and it was tied, and there was a slit cut in the dress, and you had lots of layers, and you would reach in and grab something, and that was their private space for snacks and snuff boxes and flasks and cash and
flasks. Well, also, can we just say the styles then were much more voluminous, and you had, I think, what were those wooden?
The
things that
the hoop skirts and things.
Hoops that brought you out very wide.
Yeah.
You could conceal, like as we saw in the Nutcracker, children. Small hordes of children.
Yeah, and then as fashion changed, women were given back their pockets and then forced to reclaim them later on. So when Jane Austen, the fashion gets a lot more fitted, and
Yes.
women lost their pockets. They started having to wear purses, which I'm sure they thought was a real
Hardship.
tragedy.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, men had pockets sewn into their trousers, so they could carry on with their pockets, carrying whatever they liked. And so
Frogs, paper
Yeah.
Dirt.
half-eaten chocolate bars.
And then during World War II, women were back in the workplace, You had the Rosie the Riveter style where she wore men's slacks and it had lots of pockets. And then after the war, it was back to normal. Christian Dior once said in 1954, "Men have pockets to keep things in, women for decoration."
Wow.
Oh, the oppression.
The oppression. It says, actually, the Washington Post article says, the lack of pockets not only restricts girls' ability to explore and discover, it also signals a limited view of what they can and ought to do. This should be unacceptable in 2020. It also inhibits their ability to leave change in the sofa.
So you raised 2 girls. I only raised boys.
Yeah.
But I have to say, little children do not need pockets. They don't have to have money.
They shouldn't have pockets.
They don't have to have money with them. They don't have to have their credit card. They don't have to have their ID. Why do children need pockets at all? They really don't need pockets. And in fact, my boys hated those cargo pants that had those big pockets.
Oh, yeah, and the little loops.
Or hammers or whatever it was they were supposed to hang there. Yeah, no, they hated all that stuff. Little did they know that it was a sign that they were the master race.
Right, and much freer. But what do you think of? Okay, this is my daughters who are very fashion conscious have opinions on grown men wearing cargo shorts.
Oh, yeah, that's a thing. I know that's a thing. It doesn't offend me, but I know that for some people it's a fashion crime.
So how is it a fashion crime if they are just merely well, maybe because they're showing
their superiority, yeah. Now, I have to tell you that my husband always wears, like when we travel in particular, he will always wear a blue blazer on the airplane and so on, and he refers to this as his purse. Why? Because it's got pockets on the inside where he can stick his passport and his whatever, and he says, this is my purse. But he, I think, if it weren't frowned upon, would carry a bag.
I think the problem with not men in purses, because the French have, for a long time trying to make that chic, but men in cargo pants, I think there's a problem. We have a culture of men dressing as 8-year-olds. T-shirts.
And acting as 8-year-olds. Sorry, but...
Yeah. Like dinosaurs on the front and then those little shorts. But they're 35 and they're wearing a baseball cap.
Yeah.
I just came back. I was in California for some of last week, and I really love athleisure wear, and I think that's okay. I realize this is pushing me into my retiree years, but the Californians do it very chicly, and the men look good in their kind of sleek athletic gear, but dressing like an 8-year-old, I think, is not a good look.
Yeah, what do you think was the best era in history for men's fashion?
Oh, what era was Cary Grant? 1960s.
I like Edwardian.
Me too. I like Edwardian.
Okay, what do you like in
like
the
Howard's End?
Yeah, I like the high collars.
The layers.
Yeah, and it's more modern than a Victorian style. It's a little bit slimmer. I guess we were talking about slimmer cuts. But it's still very, very chic. And their hair, they don't have the
facial hair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the early 60s, not the hippie 60s, but when the Mad Men era, when men, and they all wore hats. I thought that was nice too. Yeah. I like the hat look. They all look like grown-ups. They all look like they should be holding a martini.
Yeah.
A man in cargo pants and a dinosaur T-shirt looks like he should be holding plasticine in a sippy cup.
True.
All right.
Fair enough.
Well, one last thing before we go to our guest, and our guest I will tell you about in a minute, which I'm very excited about. There is more oppressed fabric news. And this is in the quilting community. This is also from the Washington Post, that apparently recently, it says, a usually cheery online community of quilters has been ripped apart by a sewing challenge depicting a number 2 pencil erasing the "in" from the word injustice. Some members members of the National Quilt Museum's Block of the Month Club, that exists, which gives out quilting patterns from an array of artists, objected to the January block. The design was created by something called the Social Justice Sewing Academy. And this was, even though it was meant as a kind of, Black Lives Matter spirited quilt block, it was seen as offensive. And it just became this huge controversy within the quilting community. I didn't even know the quilting community.
You didn't know about the quilting community.
I didn't know
I'm
about
ashamed of you.
It's called, where is it? It says the museum's chief executive, a man, Frank Bennett, had to jump into the fray with a statement that encouraged tolerance. Let's be an inclusive community and consider voices different from our own. He wrote in a post that tied quilting to movements to end slavery, promote suffrage, and eradicate AIDS. But 2 weeks later, the controversy was still raging, much to his surprise. And I think the correct term for this is the online crafting communities.
Oh.
So let's be careful with the language.
Yeah, and I will make a note of that.
And actually, last summer, I now vaguely remember this, the website Ravelry, a knitting and crochet group with some 8 million members, announced it was banning any post, comment, or pattern connected to President Trump and his administration.
So, sorry to be serious with you for just a sec, but
this is very serious. I don't know why you're not taking this serious. Even about Trayvon Martin, I'm skimming down this story. Oh my goodness!
But there is hardly anything in American life now that isn't politicized and that isn't dragged into the culture wars, and that's what's happening here. I mean, you think that people who like to knit and crochet and do whatever it is they do with quilts, you would think that they would sort of just exchange ideas about
focus on bird life and
flora. Right. But no, they have to get political. And there's this story, I don't remember where I saw this, but it was, somebody their car breaks down and they call a towing company, and the towing company takes a look at their bumper sticker, which is a pro-Trump bumper sticker, and they say, I don't deal with people like you, and drives off. And that's where we are. It does infiltrate into absolutely everything. So why not the quilting community, which I knew all about? Okay, unlike you.
I'm surprised you did not raise this story in a tone of outrage.
Listen, there are something like 8 million people on Ravelry. Yeah.
8 million members.
That's a beautiful thing.
And you'd think quilting would be just this way of tuning out.
Well, you would think that, and it should be. God,
what
it should be.
What would a Trump quilt look like? I think there'd be one square with like Filet-O-Fish sandwiches, right?
Or Chick-fil-A.
Chick-fil-A would be another. A lot of fast food themes.
Yes. And there would be quite a lot of hair sticking out over the back collar.
A lot of orange. Furry squares, like made out of that, shaggy.
And how would you do the really ultra long ties? I don't know. You'd have to
take that over several squares.
Yes. That would have to be a theme.
No Ukrainian wool.
Right.
All right. Well, we're going to bring on our guest. Her name is Judith Shulevitz. She's a journalist. I love her articles. She writes often for The Atlantic. She also writes for the New York Times. She's the author of The Sabbath World, Glimpses of a Different Order of Time. A lot of her subjects are about how we've lost time in this modern world, and that everything, it's not just digital, but the way we approach work is taking its toll on our psyches and our relationships. And the recent article that caught our interest was in The Atlantic. It was called Why You Never See Your Friends Anymore. Our unpredictable and overburdened schedules are taking a dire toll on American society. So we're going to bring her in to talk about that. This will explain why I don't see Mona as often as I want to. Let's bring on Judith. welcome to the Femsplainers.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
We were talking just before you came on. Well, first of all, I'm such a fan of so many of your articles, but you really are all over how digital devices are ruining our lives and all the sort of nuances of modern society and the habits that we are picking up that are taking such a toll on us. Tell us, I want to talk first about your article, Why You Never See Your Friends Anymore, which was recently in The Atlantic. You began the article with a Stalinist experiment with something called, I'm not going to pronounce it right, but Nepravika, or basically that Stalin in Soviet Russia decided to eliminate the 7-day work week for a 5-day week with no collective rest day. And that, unsurprisingly, went bad. So maybe you could start with that.
Well, I never try to pronounce the word. My sister was actually a Russian major, so she's tried to teach it to me, but she's failed. So I simply say continuous work week because I think that's a little more resonant today anyway. So yeah, it translates as continuous work week. And that was why Stalin did that. He, it was during the, Great Leap Forward. Wait, that might have been Mao. But anyway, it was during the effort to speed up production and sort of thrust what he thought of as a backward country into the modern industrial age.
That would have been the time when they were all supposed to be Stakhanovites, right? I'm guessing.
Exactly.
Yes.
A Stakhanovite? What is
Stakhanovite? Stakhanov was this supposedly, tireless worker who was constantly, doing 700-hour weeks.
Oh, like a mythical slash pop figure.
He actually was a person, but he was held up as the model. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So the point was keep those machines running. And the thought was to have continuous coverage. And, if you had to stop the machines on weekends, then you were wasting them. So now this is actually a concept we're familiar with now, but imposing the rule from above, they decided to divide the entire workforce into 5 groups, and each group would have its rest day on a different day of the week. And they would simply eliminate the weekend. Too problematic to ask people to work on the weekend. The habits die hard. So they just got rid of it, which was not actually antithetical with their values, because Lenin's widow at the time commented that getting rid of Sunday family reunions was reason enough to do this. After all, that bourgeois institution, the family was not in sync with communist values. So anyway,
those Lenins were so sentimental.
Yeah, they were. So how did this work? How did you know which group you were in? So you got a colored slip of paper. The colors were yellow, orange, red, purple, or green. And you basically could only socialize on your day off with the people of your color. This was a radical restructuring of society. And, you would think, again, the Soviets were not concerned with keeping families together, so women were working. And technically, managers were supposed to keep husbands and wives together, but they didn't necessarily.
Not that famous Soviet efficiency.
Yeah, exactly. Or it's not that collective, really, when you think about it. It's a little unfriendly. But anyway, it didn't really work. The workers sort of essentially affected a slowdown. There was a lot of breakage in the machinery, whether that was sabotage or just genuinely like having different people take over different workstations every day was not good for the machines. And I love this quote from Pravda because it features a worker who, at the time was being unbelievably brave to criticize the government. And he said, "What are we to do at home if the wife is in the factory, the children in school, and no one can come see us? What is left to go to the public tea room? by the way. I'm imagining it's not the tea room. What kind of life is that when holidays come in shifts and not for all workers together? That's no holiday if you have to celebrate by yourself. So, so I started with that anecdote. It was an anecdote sort of buried at the end of a book I published a decade ago called The Sabbath World, which was about what I called, in a slightly perhaps difficult to parse phrase, the social morality of time, which is the idea that there is a moral consciousness and a social consciousness sort of embedded in the way we organize time. So my editor at The Atlantic read that, and she was like, wow, that's so cool. Nobody will remember your book, so why don't you use that anecdote? And the thesis of the article, and, to some degree the thesis of that section of the book, is that, we're not victims of, this kind of tyrannical attempt at social engineering. We just do it to ourselves now, or the markets do it to us.
Right. We've recreated Stalinist nepravika in our modern economy.
Yeah, I'm going to praise you to my sister. I'm going to tell her.
I'm just bluffing.
Okay.
So how is it that we've replicated this? I mean, clearly we still have 7 days. We didn't eliminate the weekend. We still have weekends, as it were.
No, we didn't eliminate the weekend, and it would be it's a little overstating the case to say everybody works on weekends. They don't. More people than not still work the Monday to Friday week, but at the lower and upper ends of the workforce, it's harder and harder to stick with that. So if you if you have a low income job, you are more likely to be subject to what's called just-in-time scheduling, which means that you might not know your schedule until 3 days in advance, and it's not likely to be a normal 9-to-5 schedule. They have algorithms that calculate when the flow of traffic is heaviest, and they try to make sure that stores. This is very common in retail. They try to make sure that the stores are fully staffed when they're in heaviest use. And you have to, if you work one of these jobs, and this includes, say, an Amazon warehouse, a call center, a McDonald's, an IKEA, a Home Depot, a Gap. If you are a salesperson at one of these jobs, you have to sort of stand ready to serve and come in when called. And that's a very tough life, and it makes it very hard to predict when you have days off, and it makes it very hard to get together. That's why it's called why you never see your friends anymore. I think it has actually more serious consequences. The Atlantic sort of plucked out the least serious consequence for the title. And at the upper end of the workforce, as you know, it's people are, if they're at McKinsey or Goldman Sachs or whatever, they are expected to work these incredibly long hours, be available on weekends, even if they don't come in. They should be answering emails. Associates at law firms are working 60, 80-hour weeks. This also, because you are also sort of working at the whim of a boss or on the schedule of, closing a deal or whatever it is, you, again, have a hard time predicting when you're going to be available. And this takes a very heavy toll on people personally, which I can describe if you want, but it takes also on just this concept that there is time set aside to have community, to be together as a community, as families and communities.
Judith, Mona here. Your article really resonated with me. I have noticed that, for example, with young people who are just starting, just out of college, in their first white-collar job, there has been this erasure of boundaries between what is work and what isn't because of technology, because you've got your laptop open and your boss can be sending you emails and it's the weekend, but there seems to be a lot less respect these days for the fact that an employee is not is not at work, and bosses seem to intrude more and more on people's time that used to be considered sacred and their own.
Yeah. It's definitely a sign that you're not a young, enterprising, self-starter if you don't answer the boss's email on Saturday. Definitely not good.
Yeah.
Or, at 11 o'clock at night. There's this kind of ethos, I used to think of it back when I wrote my book. I thought of it as machismo, but I think it's, less gendered than that these days. But,
right.
It's, definitely this cult of work that people internalize. They certainly internalize it. They are afraid there's an arms race going on. If I'm not going to do it, then I'm going to be out. I'm going to be beaten out by the next gal over there who's doing it.
Yeah. Have you found that this is? Sorry. Mm-hmm. Have you found that this is a different? So I see this a lot, and I sort of call it the worship of work. Do you think there's a difference? Have you noticed a difference between American attitudes and European ones, for example? I think they're a little bit more relaxed about work, aren't they?
Yes. I mean, for example, the French expect to have a 30-hour week, or not have it, they don't anymore. And, I've lived in France and I've lived in Germany. And so those are the two countries I can speak of. And in both those places, and in France in particular, in France, August is sacred.
Right.
Don't mess with my August. I'm going to my country house. I'm going wherever I'm traveling. That is a sacred time. That's just inconceivable in the United States, where we're lucky to get 2 weeks of vacation a year, paid vacation a year. And it's not true that we work the longest hours, but there are other places that beat us out on that. But I would say definitely there is just a decline of other values and, as you say, a worship of work. That's been there as long as I can remember.
Well, you said that why you never see your friends anymore was one of the least problematic results of this culture. You said in this article that families, in fact, pay the steepest price. How so?
Well, let's see. Well, one thing is that it forces women in particular, or whoever's doing childcare, out of the workforce, right? You simply, children just don't work. They didn't work on a 9-to-5 schedule, and, they don't grow up on a 9-to-5 schedule, and they don't, you can't, it's very hard to arrange childcare if you don't, they have to be cared continuously, and it's very hard to arrange for that if you don't know when you're going to be working. What are you going to tell the babysitter? What are you going to tell the daycare center? So it forces, let's just say, to be not sexist about it, let's just say caregivers out of the workforce. Of course, those are mostly women. So that's one thing, but I don't even think that's the worst thing. I think the worst thing is how much stress it puts on parents, and again, at the upper echelon, it means that parents don't see kids that much, and they suffer from a sense of abandonment. They are more likely to be obese. They're more likely to have cognitive deficits, and you find things sort of at the lower echelon. There's an anecdote that I tell about a woman who works at an Amazon warehouse and whose husband has a security guard job, and she comes home an hour before he has to leave, and he's just waking up, and because he works nights, and basically they try to get together on Monday. They usually have Monday off at the same time, and that's just no way to have a marriage.
To Mona's point, I was thinking as reading your article, like this worship of work, which has been definitely exacerbated by the fact that we're all available 24 hours. But thinking back to my own childhood in the 70s, and my dad was the editor of a newspaper. And, I mean, he was a naturally, productive writer. But nonetheless, he ran the newspaper, wrote an editorial, came home at 6 p.m. My mother also worked. She was home at 6 p.m. And after 6 p.m., that was it. That somehow the world went on, the newspaper was produced, jobs were done within that time frame. And I think I think this idea, it's like watching my daughter study for hours and hours and hours and hours. And I don't think it gets you better marks. It's just this idea that unless you're staring into a screen or putting in this insane number of hours, you're not going to be as productive, or the company is not going to be as productive. And I'm sure that's been disproven. As you said, I mean, I think that you said something about Americans aren't even working the most hours. But have you seen any economic productivity study which shows that all this time spent at work improves the product and the outcome?
I actually don't have those figures at my fingertips, but let's go back to the question of journalism. I mean, I think we're not just dealing with a kind of lack of self-discipline, the inability to stay within these fixed schedules. As you know, since you're both journalists, journalism has actually really changed.
Well, that's true. It's now the internet. He didn't have to deal with that, the 24/7 news cycle.
He didn't have to do continuous updating, right?
Right.
He didn't have to keep feeding the beast. And now, you have young journalists sort of writing 5 stories a day, and, there just has to be something new on a news site every hour or whatever it is. So, that definitely has changed. I mean, hopefully the workforces are scheduled such that, your father today could come home at 6 o'clock and not be back on call, but, he probably would be.
Can I just add a little anecdote to that as well? My husband, who's a lawyer, talks about how when he first started in practice, which was about 30 years ago, the workday, no matter how intense the workday was, it ended at around 6:30, which was when the last FedEx delivery was leaving, right? So you had to get all your paperwork done by then, and so the FedEx would pick it up, and then you were done. But, of course, once fax machines and the internet came along, then there was never an end. And there was never a natural end, I should say. And I'm just wondering, Judith, is there a sense of any solution to regain that private space and private time? How do people do it, if they do at all?
I think that's a really good question. There are starting to be this legislation. It tends to be local, in specific cities. One is called the right to disconnect. That's actually been adopted in France and Italy. You do not have to answer your email after hours.
They didn't need it in France. We are always disconnected, so it's not a problem here.
Le droit de disconnect. And there's also these fair work week laws in various cities around the country, which require employers to give, and again, these are generally low-income workers, 2 weeks rather than 3 days or even 24-hour notice of what their schedule is going to be, and to make a sort of defensible effort a visible effort to give people regular schedules, even if they're not 9-to-5 schedules. So just in the workforce, this is starting to happen. There are starting to be books on things like the Opt-Out Society, and people sort of saying, well, you have to disconnect. I don't think just disconnecting is the answer, because what interests me is social time and not individual time. Mm-hmm. And it's not even just at the level of the family, although that's tremendously important. Families also are parts of communities, and communities need time to come together. So the whole point of my book about the Sabbath was not that I was praising this religious practice, but that I was praising it as a stroke of sociological genius, because it created a common time in which civic bonds could be formed. And Jews consolidated themselves sort of around the Sabbath.
Right.
The famous saying, it wasn't Jews who invented the Sabbath; it was the Sabbath who invented Jews. And that's what the Ahad Ha'am who said that was meant. But in America, what it meant was opportunities to visit if you wanted to be unstructured, or community organizations if you wanted to be structured about it. And that's, I think, what gets lost in this whole discourse of unplugging. It's not enough to unplug alone.
Right.
You had a great line in that article. You said it's a cliche among political philosophers that if you want to create the conditions for tyranny, you sever the bonds of intimate relationships in local community. Quote, totalitarian movements are mass organizations of atomized, isolated individuals, quoted Hannah Arendt. You also noted that I'd love you to expand on that idea of the social morality of time, and in fact how it went back to the very founding of our nation with the Puritans.
Yes, I mean, a lot of people don't remember that one of the things the Puritans objected to at the time that they came to America was the loosening of Sabbath laws. Things like bear baiting on Sunday, which was permitted. The opening of inns and that sort of thing. They were seeking a stricter, sterner Sabbath, which you and I would not like very much. But,
No, there was a lot of church going and improving reading of the Bible, I think. It wasn't like you could just chillax, as my nephew would say.
They did not chillax. Churches were mandatory no matter the weather. There were, men who walked up and down the aisles and rapped you if you weren't paying attention. If you were a servant, you had to sit patiently on your day off while the master of the household read to you from the scriptures, and, not necessarily pleasant.
Yeah, but they were pikers compared to Orthodox Jews, who also don't use electricity or drive cars or do a lot of other things on the Sabbath.
Modern Jews are.
I don't know if anyone on this call has experienced that.
Yeah.
I have many times. Yeah.
It looks to me it just looks exhausting watching all the rules that go on.
It's exhausting, and yet it's also liberating because, as Judith was saying, it does give time for community and family and reading books and, being together. It's a beautiful thing for a lot of people.
Yeah, I have a whole chapter in my book about the relationship between reading and the Sabbath, and how this notion of a time that is not devoted to sort of productivity makes possible the consumption of literature and to perhaps the creation, but the consumption of literature, the consumption of the Bible. I agree. I don't know which of you said that it can be liberating. Was that you, Danielle?
It was Mona.
It was me.
Yep.
Oh, Mona. Yeah. Okay. I agree that it can be liberating. The book is about a deep ambivalence toward the Sabbath itself and a kind of romanticization of the Orthodox Sabbath, which I am personally incapable of, putting together. But I recognize I've participated in it, and I get that there's something quite wonderful about it. There's a kind of drunken Friday night, an ethos of getting a little tipsy on Friday night. There's a lot of hanging out after synagogue. There's a lot of eating. You're supposed to have sex if you're married, of course. There is a real distinction made between all other time and this time, and it has to be created. There's a choreography that you create, and it's a choreography, you could say, of proto-unplugging. And it goes, to extremes that, unless you study the Talmud and you understand the rabbi's rationale, seems completely insane. But it does have the effect of really transforming the texture of the time and creating something pretty magical. Now, a lot of this falls on women, I'm afraid, on Friday.
Well, that's the exhausting part in my mind, like having to have all your food ready and...
Yes, exactly. You have to have your food ready. You have to put away forbidden objects that you might be tempted to use for work, like scissors. You have to, make sure the children are scrubbed and in their fancy clothes. You have to make sure that the best china's set out, and yes, you have to cook a fancy meal.
Every single week, yes.
Production. Yeah, and it makes, it's hard.
Yes.
I don't know how, a lot of Orthodox women work. There's not an ethos of not working, among Orthodox Jews,
right.
Orthodox Jewish women. So I have no idea how they do it.
Right. Some have help. But I did hear a rabbi, though, once describe that Jews, rather than hallowing objects, hallow time. And right. I thought that was a good description of it at its best. But you're absolutely right. It does exact more of a toll on women, just in practical terms, than on men. And I don't know how you get around that.
Some friends of mine, and actually Jewish friends of mine who are more modern, not Orthodox, will declare an electronic Sabbath,
yeah.
which I think is a great idea, where everybody has to put away all devices.
Yeah.
And, board games come out and
right.
reading. And
yeah, that is a good idea.
I've always wanted to do it. But I mean, there have been times I think we've all experienced it. And I realize that just simply unplugging isn't the key. But, I've gone to walk the dogs and realized halfway down the hill that I've forgotten my phone.
Right.
And had this sort of short panic and then realized I don't need it. And suddenly it's the walk is twice as enjoyable because you're not in that mental anticipatory state. You're sort of much more mentally present in whatever it is you're doing. Mm-hmm. You're not having what my husband once described Twitter as being. He said, even when you're off Twitter, it's like, imagine if there's a party going on in the next room and you keep hearing your name said, right. now and again. That your ear is always half cocked to that,
right?
To that world, to that noise. And I honestly don't know how we are going to be able, as a society, to disconnect, let alone come together in the way that you say is so important.
Right. There are these sort of voluntaristic movements, but again, I do feel like we miss this notion that you can't do it alone. It's like trying to give up drinking. You can't do it alone. You have to do it collectively because. You just, then if you're trying to do it alone, you're not necessarily going to be able to have meaningful interactions because everyone else is checking their phone, or listening. Like when I walk my dog, I know exactly what you're talking about. I go into a little panic because I think, oh no, I was going to be listening to this podcast or that podcast.
Mm-hmm.
It's my special time to listen to the podcast. And now I'm missing it. And what I'm missing when I do listen to the podcast is the birds and the trees, because I'm lucky enough to be able to walk my dog in a park, even though I live in a city. But I do have to tell you one funny story about the electronic Sabbath, which is that's what we observed until adolescence destroyed that, and the kids were just like much too attached to their phones. And too many other families in our synagogue did not observe an electronic Sabbath, and it just stopped working. But when they were little, that's what we did. And my daughter once got into a very lively argument with a friend of ours who was Orthodox, with a friend of hers who was Orthodox, in which she insisted that the ban for the Sabbath was on electronics, not electricity. And I had to tell her that actually the ban was on electricity. You weren't actually supposed to turn lights on and off. It's not that just that you weren't supposed to turn the television on and off. That was sort of mortifying. It was like, oh, my infallibility has just been shattered. But yeah, no, again, this goes back to the social morality of time. We have to, as a society, decide that we want to recreate these barriers. And I honestly think it's going to be very hard. And I do applaud the small manifestations of that kind of consciousness with these kinds of legislation.
Could I just add one last thought? This is Mona again. Do you see a connection here between this invasion by work of our private time with just the overall loss of privacy in general, those devices that we tell so many, well, at least the younger people tell it so much of what they're doing and where they are, and they voluntarily give up their privacy, and then their work world is intruding on private time, and the whole concept of an intimate private time and space in your life seems to get eroded.
I completely agree, and also the notion of face-to-face time. I find my kids' generation spends less time hanging out. I remember I actually helped raise, I raised my own kids, and I helped raise an older set of kids because I'm married to a man who was divorced and had a family. And, that was a generation before the iPhone, and they didn't date, they hung out,
Mm-hmm.
And now my kids don't even hang out.
How old are your kids?
My kids are 16 and 17. They FaceTime,
Yeah.
And they Instagram and they endlessly communicate through social media, which the older kids did not. And they look sort of askance at their half brother and sister and wonder. But I think that what you're talking about with this loss of privacy, the relationship between the loss of the boundaries of time and the loss of the boundaries of self is really interesting. And I think there's really something to that. We just don't have this notion that there are boundaries. We don't like boundaries.
Right.
Boundaries are disappearing. I am shocked by how readily I tell my children, hey, TikTok is a device for China to sweep up your information.
Yes.
And my daughter's a budding economist, so she's very interested in economics, and she's very alarmed by China and is always ranting on about it. And I said, yet you spend hours on TikTok. He says, "Look, it's so fun."
Mm-hmm.
And it is fun.
Yeah.
I've never looked at TikTok. But, it is, and she doesn't have time. They don't have time boundaries in terms of doing their homework. She goes to a very demanding school. She does hours of homework every day. But if she were to put the phone away while she did her homework, she'd be done in 2-3 hours.
Right.
It drags on all night because there's all this
interruption,
chatting going.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and to go back to this, your totalitarian analogy, when we're talking about walking in a park without an electronic device, and you can hear the birds, as you mentioned, you're much more aware of your surroundings, but your thoughts also take turns that they never really have that time and space to do. That I'm always struck by. Before the iPhone and everything, when I would walk the dogs, I was usually writing something. And when I couldn't write anymore, I'd get up and I'd go for the walk. And suddenly all these mental barriers I'd had, the corners I'd worked myself into, it all came back. It fixed itself. I figured out solved problems. And I realized how important that was to just the creative process. But it's that time we allow ourselves to think things through, to turn over in our heads an exchange we've had with something, or think about a personal problem or issue. But that kind of thinking can only exist in that kind of undistracted space. And as you say, when you look at my youngest is 18, sometimes I see them deliberately turning off. Like, she prefers actual books to reading things online. Like, when she reads now, she buys a book. She doesn't read it on her computer or a Kindle. So I'm sort of interested that it seems like at some level, and we may see a whole fashion or movement to people doing this because they're aware, but in the end, this loss of kind of free thought is distressing.
Yes, I agree with you entirely. And I am very guilty of it,
we all are.
Myself, but yeah. Because, we just think, okay, we're going to endlessly check impeachment news.
Really? Is that going on?
Yeah. I actually have entire, periods of time where I just think, no, I can't take this anymore. I'm not even going to read the news.
I was kind of more absorbed with Megxit, I have to admit.
Oh, Megxit's pretty good. makes it really good, and lends itself more readily to dinner conversation, I would add.
Yeah, well, not in my house. I'm a little more obsessed with it than others. So.
Okay.
I have people you can talk to.
Thank God.
I know who are also obsessed. But,
well, anyway, so are you? So do we leave this conversation on a note of hope or hopelessness? Do you think, Judith?
I think I'm a little hopeful. I'm not massively hopeful. It's like the privacy movement. I think people definitely there's a disenchantment with tech that's going on, and there's a less gee whiz attitude toward all of this, and I think that's good. What it can lead to, I don't know, because I think there's very profound structural forces at work that, it's pretty hard for us to fight, and it's going to take a big effort to fight it. I think that I guess you have to start at the family level, and you have to start by teaching kids and parents when the kids are little in school to really limit this kind of time, this social media time, and to teach and also maybe make it not a thing of depriving them of something, but of adding something, like you were saying, teaching them the value of just having free-flowing thought. I don't know how successful you can be in doing that with children. I mean, I always used to say to my child, I'm glad you're bored.
Exactly. Figure that one out.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was never a very successful strategy, though. But I mean, if we can make it, if we can sell the public on the idea that there's something good to be gotten and not that we're just going to take your devices away from you.
Well, now that we've discovered Alexa is a double agent, Like that flips me out. I don't have any of those things in my home.
Nor do I.
Terrified like my microwave is going to start spying on me.
Well, all these smart objects, I mean, it's really scary. We're just bringing so many surveillance devices into our homes. I have, after I did that piece, I put my Alexa and all of those devices that I talked about, I did a piece on this for The Atlantic. I put them all in a drawer, and every so often I look at them and I think, I'm so glad they're unplugged.
Next, we'll find out that even when they're unplugged, they're still spying on
electronic prison, electronic solitary confinement. Oh man!
Yeah, exactly.
But we are just on the cusp.
They are always spying on you, and I intend to go to my grave having had a stupid house.
Yeah. Agreed.
A friend of ours, we tease her that she lives in 1900 house. Yeah. But actually, I think that's the way to go.
No, agreed. We got rid of those smart thermostats and all of that. I mean, they send information about what temperature you like your house at to some central computerized location. I don't want them knowing. But anyway, look, you've made a huge contribution, Judith, to our awareness about the trade-offs, and I think we're just at the infancy of figuring out, how to possibly regain some control over these changes in our life that technology has brought, and I think it's just getting started. But the first step is recognizing.
So you're hopeful.
I am. I mean, I am hopeful.
And Mona's never hopeful.
I'm never I'm never hopeful. But on this, I think of it the way, sort of in the broad sweep of history. How throughout history, human beings have figured out new weapons, and every time a new weapon gets invented, there's a new defense against the weapon that quickly gets developed too. So you have a sword, and then you have a shield, and you have cannons, and then you have fortresses, and so on. Anyway, there's always a yin and yang, and I do think that even in this, there will be a response that people will recognize that this is not. I mean, it's obviously it's a very positive thing in many ways, having these devices, but we're going to figure out, I think, how to get more balance. I think right now we're very out of balance, and especially for teenage girls, it seems to have been a problem, causing depression and anxiety and all kinds of other negatives. But I do think that we'll figure it out.
Okay, well,
that is very, very encouraging. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and if you knew how pessimistic Mona is generally, I'm just knocked out by this, so I'm really happy now.
Once every 100 years, I say something optimistic.
Anyway, Judith, thank you so much. Thanks for calling in. We really appreciate it and hope to have you back because you are always writing about interesting things.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. So
take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
I'm so thrilled you are optimistic, Mona, about this whole...
Mark your calendars.
Mark
the
it.
one time.
Well, I hope so. I hope so. But that was really interesting.
She's great. I've been a fan of hers for a very long time. She did a piece a long time ago about brown students who were so upset about somebody coming to might even have been Christina coming to campus to give
probably
a talk.
was.
It probably was Christina. that they were retreating to rooms where they had images of puppies and they had
that was
crayons.
Christina.
Okay, so it was Christina, right?
Yeah.
And she wrote that great piece about hiding out in the Ivy League from uncomfortable ideas. And anyway, so I've been a fan of hers ever since.
Well, one of the things actually that has been part of that. Criticism of these college students is that they now have like coloring sessions and things. And I walked in on my own 18-year-old daughter the other night. It was during exam period. And she was doing a paint by numbers thing that she'd ordered online. And I said, I've never seen you do paint by numbers. She goes, Mom, it's so distressing. And I thought, like hyphen. And I thought, I'm not going to criticize these students. Like if you're going offline, I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, I can't listen to Christina Hoff Sommers. I need a coloring book. That's a little juvenile. But I think this is part of disconnecting, that they're going to these adult coloring books and these paint by numbers and anything that takes them out of that world. And I think that's not a bad thing.
I'm sorry. The corners of my mouth are turning up because at the dog park the other day, somebody left an adult coloring book of a totally different kind.
Oh, really?
Yes. I didn't know such things existed, but now I know.
Like The Joy of Sex, but as a coloring book?
I don't even want to go. I'm not going to say what it was.
Maybe it was a medical coloring book. All right. Well, Mona, we're going to have some... Ella and I are going to do a little listener reaction, but we're going to free Mona from this podcast studio so she can disconnect from us. But Mona, what a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for the invitation. I loved doing this. Well, thank you.
We hope to have you back in all forms as guest, and if Christina bails on me again, that would be wonderful.
Be my pleasure.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Mona.
Take care.
Okay, Ella, we have a little bit of time. I love it when you guys interact on Twitter or Facebook because we do read your comments. And after Marissa Orr was talking last week about basically women not wanting to be CEOs, women and men not wanting to be CEOs, and why, the gap of women in the workforce is not closing despite all these pushes, you guys had some interesting comments, right? Ella, these are from Facebook.
Yes. So we have a comment from Emily. She says, I'm a woman in STEM-type work, cancer detection research, and there are plenty of women here. My boss and my boss's boss are both female. It always drove me nuts when I was in college engineering school that the women in science chicks would harangue the hell out of me almost daily with emails and similar. They always tried to claim some sort of oppression, yet even in my advanced math and science classes, I never saw or felt anything of the sort. I just wanted to be left alone to earn my degree on my merits, not the fact that I'm a girl. Same with my professional life. Any promotions, projects, etc. I want it to be because I earned them, not to fill a quota. And then this is from Heidi, who says, I think most women who want children want to spend some amount of time with them. So that prevents
Depends on the kids, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that prevents them from being the person in the office who works 80 hours a week, which is what it takes to get to the top. So it becomes a bit of a numbers game, as it's a small pool of women without children who are competent enough to be CEO.
Yeah, well, it's these mixed messages, right? Like on the one hand, we're all bemoaning, as we have been, about being, these crazy work weeks and never disconnecting. And then But, how are women going to get ahead? And yet, really, I think most of us don't want that. It's up to your generation, Ella, to save us from this, to figure out, what is really meaningful in life, how to meaningfully spend our time. It is not always at the office or responding to emails from our bosses.
Well, maybe we can all move to France.
Why do the French always have it figured out? And they smoke and they drink red wine and they eat fatty foods, and yet they live longer than anyone on the planet.
But they lose all their wars and they have to rely on us to save them. So
well, they've figured that out. That's very clever.
True, actually,
yeah. Okay. Any more?
Yeah, here's one from Liam. Wow, it's almost like Fortune 500 CEO positions are ridiculously competitive and men are massively more likely to earn that type of position. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else on, that was Facebook. Sorry. Mm-hmm. We finished with the Facebook. Thank you.
Yes.
There were a lot of comments on that post, I think. So go check it out at Femsplainers on Facebook.
And then we have some more listener reaction from Lana, this time about Megxit.
Yeah, you said this time because Lana writes us a lot. Hi, Lana.
Yes. She says, I don't follow the royal family at all, but I was affronted by your comment that the royal succession was Meghan separating her husband from his friends. Maybe it is, but maybe it's not. Maybe after marrying her, he saw something that turned him off from his family and friends. Life cycle events and tradition have a way of making otherwise amenable people act bizarre, and I respected my grandfather for decades until I saw how he treated my fiancé. I've since been unable to regain the lost feelings, and I have not visited my grandparents as often as they'd like. So here's my input. Maybe Meghan was a catalyst to Harry moving away from his family, not an active driver. And even if she vanished in a poof of smoke today, he might never be able again to regain what was lost. Once you see people for who they are and what they truly value, how can you ever unsee it?
Well, Lana, that's a good point. And Ella knows how excited I get about talking about Megxit, so I will just try to control myself. But I think you're absolutely right that sometimes when you look at married couples and you say, God, why would he or she ever marry someone like that? And look what it's done to their lives. And you can't always blame aside from that old cliche, you never know what's going on inside a marriage. People have unexpressed preferences too, and will marry people who maybe have the courage to take them out of situations or families that they really didn't want to be part of, even if it perplexes the families. But I'm just going to say, in this case, you have someone, Meghan, who is very estranged from all of her family, and not just the crazy members, but who cut out her grandparents, her mother's parents, who had she was close to, very respectable, sane people, expressed hurt at not being invited to the wedding. I mean, the only relative she had was her mother. And Harry, for all we know, it may be well that he had wanted to get out of this life. Some reporters who knew him from a long time ago expressed that he had wanted to separate or not be so public in this royal life. But we also know he was close, we know from everything, certainly I've ever read about it over the years, that he was close to his grandparents, the Queen, and he's close to his brother. And I get very suspicious when you just leave all that and go into isolation with someone. And I sort of wonder, just what is he going to do, really? He's had to give up his whole life to move to a foreign country where, really, what does an unemployed prince do? So I'm sort of curious as to know how they're going to make this work. I take your point, Lana, that maybe he wanted it. Friend's highly placed source with the royal family, I can report, wrote to me and said that Harry was on the verge of a mental breakdown, and that's why they had to hustle him out. You heard it here first, but I don't know about that. But anyway, I think the way it was handled was bad. And to your point about grandparents not liking fiancés, families are always complicated. Families can be difficult, but families in the end are your family. And it's important to try make things work, if not for you, for future generations. And, we all have to put up with stuff. So I don't like the idea of just because a grandparent says something or there's tension that therefore you can never have a relationship, or that's it. You can never unsee it. You can never unsay something. My husband has a phrase that you have to remember, life is long. We're always talking about how short life is, but it can also be long. And decisions you make now have far-reaching repercussions, and family life is long. So anyway, that's all I'll say on that. For those of you who are not subscribers via Patreon, ThinkSpot, or Glow, you are missing out on Christina calling in. It's very late in London, her time, but she's agreed to call in. I'm sure she's had some wine because she has a rant that she wants to do about, believe it or not, KFC. And she's staying up to call in to do her weekly rant for our subscribers who are at the $10 a month level or more. And of course, you're missing out, everybody, on our monthly bonus episode for all our subscribers at, again, Patreon, ThinkSpot, or Glow. So please subscribe. It keeps us going. We're still not fully making ends meet, and every subscription counts. We're very grateful for it. So I think that's it. So thank you, Ella, in the studio, and we'll see you next week when Christina is back. And next week we will be recording our monthly cocktail party where we're bringing in, next week we're going to bring in Emily Yoffe and Megan Gurdon, two fabulous women, and we're going to talk about everything. So please join us. Goodbye. Hey, thanks for listening to the Femsplainers. Keep up with us on Twitter and Facebook at Femsplainers and on Instagram at Femsplainers Podcast. Send questions and comments to contact@femsplainers.com.
A big thanks to Ella Ryder, our research and in-studio production assistant, and to Nat Frum, our audio and video editor. And we're proud to be part of the Ricochet Network and grateful to the American Enterprise Institute for allowing us to record in its studio every week in downtown Washington, D.C.
And miss something? You'll find everything you need at our homepage, femsplainers.com, including links to past episodes, our sponsors, where you can sign up to support us, and even to merch. And please don't forget to like us or give us 5 stars on iTunes.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.